Welcome to Inside Criminology, the podcast where theory meets real-world justice. I'm your host, and today we begin our journey with the foundations. What is criminology? How has it evolved? And why is understanding criminal law essential to studying crime? Let's explore the roots of criminological theory and how they continue to shape our world today.
So this deep dive is really an exploration of some foundational source material you shared. We want to unpack the core concepts, see how the field developed, and figure out why looking at the law itself is just so critical.
Absolutely. It's key to understanding the whole picture.
So let's jump right in. What is criminology like at its heart?
Well, the classic definition, the one people usually point to, is from Sutherland and Cressy. They described it as the body of knowledge regarding crime as a social phenomenon.
Okay, crime is a social phenomenon.
Right. And they said it includes the processes of making laws, breaking laws, and reacting toward the breaking of laws.
Making, breaking, reacting. That covers a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It really does. And their goal, you see, was to develop verified principles about that whole cycle, using scientific methods, essentially. It's about the why and how.
So it's definitely aiming to be a science, not just armchair theorizing. And your source material really flags it as interdisciplinary.
Oh, hugely. You find people coming into criminology from sociology, psychology, economics, public health, even biology sometimes. Everyone brings their own toolkit to try and understand this really complex behavior.
Okay, complex is the word. Let's try and untangle something that can feel a bit murky. The connection between criminology, criminal justice, and deviance. How do they fit?
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting because they definitely overlap, but they're not the same thing. Criminology studies crime. Criminal justice is the actual system, police, courts, prisons.
Right, the apparatus.
Exactly. And deviance. That's simply behavior that goes against what society considers normal, the norms.
Okay, so where does the confusion or the overlap come in?
Well, the key thing is, not all crimes are actually seen as deviant by everyone. Maybe more surprising, not all deviant acts are crimes.
Ah, okay, give me an example.
Think about marijuana use.
Yeah.
The source material brings this up. It might be illegal, sure, but is it universally seen as deviant today? Probably not like it once was, Social views shift.
Right, the norms are definitely changing there.
Exactly. Or take a moral example the source uses. You see someone drowning and you do nothing. That feels really deviant, right? Immoral, even.
Yeah, deeply wrong.
But legally, unless you have a specific duty like a lifeguard, it's generally not a crime to just stand by. So the legal lines don't always match up perfectly with social or moral ones.
That's a really important distinction. The law draws its own boundaries.
Precisely. And a big chunk of criminology is actually studying how those boundaries get drawn and redrawn. It's the process of criminalization, how something becomes a crime.
Like the marijuana example you mentioned.
Exactly. The source points to how figures like Harry Anslinger really pushed to criminalize marijuana in the U.S. back in the 30s, painting it as this incredibly dangerous thing. That turned a previously legal act into a crime.
And created criminals out of users overnight.
Right. And now you see the opposite, decriminalization, happening, with groups arguing the criminalization itself causes more harm. It shows how definitions change.
So it's not static.
Not at all. Another example from the source is the FCC finding Howard Stern. Who gets to decide what's obscene? It shows how subjective that line can be and how it reflects social pressures and, frankly, who has the power to enforce their view.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's dynamic, not fixed.
Totally. And understanding that dynamic is why the criminal justice system really needs criminology.
Yeah.
To figure out policing strategies or sentencing or rehab programs, you need to understand the nature and causes of crime. That's what criminologists study.
Okay, so criminology is the study, deviance is the broader social context, and criminal justice is the system's response.
Got it. Now, let's rewind a bit. Your sources trace thinking about crime way back, before criminology was even a term.
Oh, yeah, way back. Think Middle Ages, like 1200 to 1600. The dominant view then was superstition. Crime, or just being different, was often blamed on, the devil, witchcraft, demonic possession.
Not exactly a scientific approach.
Hardly. And the reaction was incredibly brutal. Burning people at the stake wasn't uncommon. The source mentions figures like Nicholas Remy, Peter Binsfield, thousands executed.
Are horrifying.
It really was. And you see echoes later, like the Salem witch craze the source mentions. Punishments were harsh across the board, whipping, branding, death. There's also this grim idea of inferior blood, that some people were just born bad.
A world away from how we think now, hopefully.
Definitely. Then, around the mid-1700s, things start to shift. You get the emergence of classical criminology.
This is linked to the Enlightenment, right? Reason, rationality, exactly. Thinkers started emphasizing free will. The big names here are Cesare Beccaria. His book on crimes and punishments from 1764 was huge, and Jeremy Bentham with his moral calculus.
And their big idea was
That people aren't puppets of demons. They're rational. They choose crime by weighing the pleasure or benefit against the pain or cost.
so crime is a choice based on calculation.
That's the core idea. And because it's a choice, punishment should also be rational. It needs to be designed to deter, to make the pain just outweigh the potential pleasure.
The famous let the punishment fit the crime.
That's Beccaria. He argued punishment had to be public, prompt, necessary, the least possible needed, proportionate, and crucially spelled out by law, not just arbitrary.
So the key elements are free will, choice, fear of punishment, and making sure punishments are severe, certain, and swift enough.
You got it. And this thinking had a massive impact. It influenced the creation of formal legal codes, the rise of prisons as a form of punishment, structured sentencing.
And we still see echoes of this today, right? In theories like rational choice or strategies like general deterrence.
Absolutely. Those are the modern descendants of classical thought.
But then science really takes off in the 19th century and things shift again with positivism.
Right. Late 19th century, the scientific method observation, analysis, testing hypotheses starts getting applied to human behavior. And this was a fundamental change.
How so?
Instead of just focusing on free will, positivists believed behavior was determined, or at least heavily influenced, by forces beyond individual control. Things like biological factors, psychological issues, social conditions.
So less about choice, more about underlying causes.
Exactly. And they were all about using empirical methods to find those causes. Darwin's work on evolution was a huge influence here, encouraging a scientific look at human nature.
Did this lead to some, well, strange ideas early on?
It did. You had things like phrenology, reading skull bumps, or physiognomy, judging character by facial features.
Yeah.
Your source even has some of those old drawings.
Yeah.
But you also had early medical figures starting to link mental states or physical conditions to crime, like Pinel or Rush.
Which brings us to the big name, Cesare Lombroso, often called the father of criminology.
Lombroso is central here. He studied criminals, often prisoners or those executed, and came up with his theory of the born criminal. He thought some people inherited criminal traits.
Inherited? How?
He looked for physical signs he called atavistic anomalies. Things he thought were throwbacks to more primitive humans, like large jaws or strong canine teeth, weird ears.
Seriously?
Yeah. He believed these physical traits marked someone as inherently criminal, a biological throwback. He talked about direct heredity, like coming from a family of criminals, or indirect, like coming from a degenerate family.
That sounds incredibly deterministic and pretty flawed by today's standards.
Oh, his specific ideas about physical traits are totally debunked. But his method trying to systematically study offenders using scientific observation was revolutionary for its time. That's his main legacy, really.
And others followed this path.
Yes, people like Enrico Ferris, Raffaele Garofalo. Later you had others like Ernest Houghton or Charles Goring doing large empirical studies trying to find physical or other differences in criminals. William Sheldon even linked body types to delinquency.
And modern biological and psychological theories kind of grew out of this, right? Looking for internal factors, but with much better science.
Exactly. Still exploring internal influences, but in much more sophisticated ways.
Okay, so we've gone from demons to rational choice to individual biology or psychology. But what about the impact of society itself? That's where sociological criminology comes in, isn't it?
Yes, emerging late 19th, early 20th century. This perspective sees crime primarily as a product of social forces, social structures, how society is organized.
Who are the key thinkers here?
Early on, people like Quetelet used statistics a new thing. Then to show crime wasn't random. It followed patterns linked to social factors like age, gender, poverty, even climate.
And then there's Emil Durkheim, a huge figure.
Durkheim, yeah.
Oh.
Around the 1890s, he proposed something really radical, that crime is actually a normal, even functional part of any society.
Normal. Functional. How can crime be good?
His argument was, first, it's normal because you'll never get perfect conformity in any group of people. There will always be differences, and some differences get labeled criminal. Second, it can be functional or useful because it helps define moral boundaries. Punishing crime reinforces what the group values.
Okay, that makes a bit more sense.
And he also argued crime can pave the way for social change. Sometimes today's crime is tomorrow's progress. Think about civil rights protesters, for example. He used Socrates as an example. Crime can also signal that something's wrong in society, like a rise in drug abuse might point to deeper social problems.
So it shifts the focus away from just the individual to the social environment.
Precisely. And he developed the concept of anomie. He saw society shifting from simple, tight-knit mechanical forms to complex, diverse, organic ones. This rapid change could lead to a breakdown of norms, a sense of confusion or normlessness anomie, which he linked to higher rates of deviance.
Which leads us to the Chicago School.
Right, around the 1920s and 30s, sociologists at the University of Chicago, like Park and Burgess, started looking at cities as ecosystems.
Yeah.
They developed this social ecology approach.
Ecology. Like how?
They mapped out crime rates in Chicago and found they weren't random. Certain areas, often the transitional zones near the city center, have persistently high crime rates, regardless of who lived there.
So it's something about the place.
That was their argument. These areas were seen as socially disorganized, high poverty, lots of people moving in and out, weak social institutions, maybe existing criminal cultures. This environment, they argued, bred crime. Thinkers like Thrasher studied gangs. Shaw and McKay mapped delinquency areas.
And they also looked at how people learn crime.
Yes, that's the other key piece. Socialization. How do family, schools, peer groups shape behavior? Edwin Sutherland's theory of differential association is maybe the most famous idea here.
Which says?
Basically, that criminal behavior is learned through interaction with others, mainly in close personal groups. You learn the techniques, but also the motives, rationalizations, and attitudes that favor breaking the law.
And modern theories like strain theory, social learning, social control, they all build on these sociological ideas.
Absolutely. They're all exploring how social structures, learning processes, or the breakdown of social bonds contribute to crime.
We've covered a lot of ground. Supernatural, rational choice, individual traits, social environment. What about power and inequality? That brings us to conflict criminology.
Right. This perspective traces its roots back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the mid-19th century. The core idea here is that crime isn't just about individuals or disorganized neighborhoods. It's a fundamental product of the conflict inherent in society, especially in capitalist systems.
Conflict between whom?
Primarily between social classes. Marx saw society divided into the owners of the means of production, the bourgeoisie, and the workers, the proletariat. The conflict view argues the whole system, including the legal system, is set up to maintain the power and advantage of the dominant class.
So the law itself serves the powerful.
That's the argument. Crime, from this perspective, is defined in ways that often target the behaviors of the powerless, while the harmful actions of the powerful, like exploitation, creating unsafe conditions, might not even be defined as crimes or are punished much less severely. The system itself, focused on competition and wealth, creates conditions where crime becomes almost inevitable for some.
The system breeds crime.
That's the radical view, yes. Early conflict theorists like Willem Bonger directly linked crime rates to economic conditions under capitalism. Later thinkers like Dahrendorf and Vold built on this. This perspective really gained traction during times of social unrest, like the 1960s in the U.S.
Leading to radical criminology.
Exactly, critiquing the entire economic and political system as the root cause of high crime rates.
And modern theories that look at power through lenses like race or gender, like radical feminism or left realism, they stem from this tradition.
They certainly do. They expand the analysis of power and conflict beyond just economics.
Wow. It's incredible how many different angles there are to this. How do all these historical schools, classical, positivist, sociological conflict, fit into criminology today?
Well, contemporary criminology is rarely just one thing. It's much more integrated. Researchers often pull ideas from different schools or try to see how multiple factors work together. Your source nicely summarizes the main modern perspectives that evolved from these roots.
Okay, let's recap those. We have classical choice perspectives.
Still focusing on rational decisions, situational factors, deterrence. Then biological, psychological perspectives, looking at individual traits, brain chemistry, personality, etc.
Then structural perspectives.
Focusing on those broader social forces, neighborhood effects, cultural norms, poverty, inequality, like the Chicago school legacy.
And process perspectives.
Those look at how people become criminal through learning, socialization, family upbringing, peer influence, or lack of social control, like Sutherland's ideas.
Then conflict perspectives.
Still examining power, inequality, how the law is made and applied, class struggle, discrimination.
And finally, developmental perspectives.
Right. These are really interesting because they try to put it all together, looking at how different factors, individual, social, economic, interact and influence offending patterns across a person's entire life, from childhood through adulthood.
So today's criminologist has this rich, complex toolbox built over centuries.
Exactly. And these different viewpoints are still very much alive, debated, researched, and refined. It's a constantly evolving field.
That historical context is crucial, but as we noted, it's not just theory, it's application. Which brings us back to the law. Why is understanding criminal law itself so fundamental?
Well, that really falls under a subfield called the sociology of law. It's all about the interplay between society and the legal system.
How society shapes law and how law shapes society.
Precisely. Criminologists look at how laws get created in the first place. What social forces, what historical events lead to certain behaviors being criminalized.
Like you mentioned with new technologies needing new laws.
Exactly. The source gives great examples. Computer crime laws emerging with the internet. Stalking laws after specific high-profile cases. Sex offender registry laws like Megan's Law after horrific crimes. The law has to adapt.
And even court decisions can fundamentally change the legal landscape, right? Like that Supreme Court case, Lawrence v. Texas.
Yes, striking down sodomy laws. The court's reasoning about liberty and private conduct shows how legal definitions reflect changing social values and interpretations of rights.
So studying the law isn't just for lawyers.
Not at all. Criminologists also look at the purpose behind criminal law. Your source lists things like enforcing social control, deterring crime, punishing offenders.
And maintaining social order.
Right. And that last one, maintaining social order, is where some conflict theorists might say, aha, order for whom? It raises questions about whose interests the law ultimately serves.
It really drives home that you can't understand crime without understanding the legal framework it's defined against and how that framework came to be.
Absolutely fundamental. It's the bedrock.
Yeah.
And beyond sociology of law, you have criminologists studying crime stats, trends, patterns. That's crucial too. And penology, which is the study of punishment and corrections.
Right. Figuring out what works, rehabilitation versus punishment, all that practical stuff.
Exactly. Connecting theory to the real-world systems.
Okay, so if understanding the law is key, how do criminologists actually define crime itself? You mentioned it's not simple.
No, it's definitely debated. How you define crime shapes everything you do as a researcher. Your source lays out three main viewpoints on this.
First up is the consensus view.
This perspective suggests that, by and large, most people in society agree on what's right and wrong. The criminal law, in this view, basically reflects this widespread consensus. Crimes are acts that genuinely offend almost everyone.
And it connects to the idea of social harm.
Yes. The argument is that criminal acts cause real damage, real harm to society or individuals, and that's why we agree they should be illegal.
What about things like drug use, so-called victimless crimes? How does the consensus view handle those?
Well, the argument there is often that they do cause harm, even if indirectly. Maybe they undermine social order or harm the users themselves or contribute to other problems. So even without an obvious victim in one specific act, there's still a perceived social harm that justifies making it illegal according to this view.
Okay, so consensus view, broad agreement, reflects shared values. What about the conflict view? How does it see the definition of crime?
Completely differently. Conflict theory, as we discussed, sees society as groups in conflict over resources and power. So the law isn't about shared values. It's a weapon used by the powerful to maintain control over the powerless.
So crime is just whatever the powerful label as crime.
Pretty much. It's a political definition. Conflict theorists often contrast street crimes, which are heavily policed and often associated with the poor, with what they call the real crimes of the powerful, things like corporate pollution, unsafe working conditions, systemic discrimination, maybe even aggressive foreign policy, things that cause massive harm but might not be illegal or are rarely prosecuted effectively.
They point to inconsistencies, right?
Exactly. Like, why are some drugs illegal while alcohol, which causes huge social costs, is legal and taxed? Why is a backroom poker game illegal, but a state lottery is fine? Conflict theorists argue these differences reflect who has the power to make the rules.
Okay, so conflict view, crime defined by power. What's the third one? The interactionist view.
This one is a bit more focused on social psychology. Like the conflict view, it sees crime as socially constructed, not inherently evil. But it emphasizes the role of specific people or groups, moral entrepreneurs, who actively campaign to have certain behaviors defined as deviant or criminal.
Like lobbying groups or activists pushing for new laws based on their moral beliefs?
Precisely. Think about campaigns against pornography, or certain types of drug use or gambling. The interactionist view says an act isn't inherently criminal. It only becomes criminal when society, often led by these moral entrepreneurs, reacts negatively and labels it as such.
This sounds like labeling theory.
Exactly. Labeling theory is a key part of the interactionist perspective. It argues that being officially labeled a criminal by police, courts is a powerful, often damaging process. It can change how people see themselves and how others see them, potentially locking them into a criminal identity.
Which suggests maybe we should be cautious about applying those labels.
Yes, proponents often argue for decriminalization or diversion from minor offenses to avoid the negative consequences of the label itself. The Howard Stern example fits here too. His content became criminal, or at least finable, because a powerful agency reacted based on shifting moral standards pushed by certain groups.
So consensus, shared values, conflict, power, interactionist, social reaction, and labels. 3 really different ways to think about what crime even is.
And often, criminologists today try to blend these ideas. Your source proposes an integrated definition, which tries to capture elements of all three. How does that go? It defines crime as a violation of societal rules of behavior as interpreted and expressed by a criminal legal code. So it acknowledges the legal code, like the consensus view, created by people holding social and political power. That brings in the conflict element. Power matters in defining the rules.
Right.
And it adds that violators are subject to state sanctions, social stigma, and loss of status. That captures the consequences of the label, like the interactionist view emphasizes. So the seized crime is this complex mix, political, social, and economic factors all playing a role.
Thinking about these different views, especially the ones questioning who gets to define crime, it really underscores the responsibility involved in studying this field.
Oh, absolutely. Criminology isn't just an academic exercise. The findings, the theories, they can have a huge impact on real people's lives, on social policy. Which brings us to some important ethical issues.
Your source highlights a few key ethical questions researchers have to grapple with. First one, what to study?
This is a big one. A lot of research funding comes from government agencies or large foundations. That's often necessary, but it can raise questions. Do funders sometimes steer research towards topics they prefer, or maybe away from topics critical of them?
A potential conflict of interest?
It can be. Funding priorities can shape the entire research landscape. Maybe lots of money flows towards drug research, but less towards investigating corporate crime, for instance. Criminologists have to strive for objectivity, regardless of where the money comes from.
Then there's the question, whom to study?
Yeah, historically there's been criticism that criminology has focused too much on crime among the poor and minority groups, while maybe overlooking crimes committed by more privileged groups.
Which could reinforce stereotypes.
That's the danger. If most studies focus on certain populations, the findings might inadvertently create or strengthen biased associations. The source mentions the whole controversy around research on IQ and race, like the bell curve, as an example of how research, whatever its intent, can be interpreted or used in ways that fuel prejudice or unjust policies.
And the third ethical question, how to study?
This is about research methods. Is it okay to mislead subjects about the purpose of a study? How much information do you need to give them, especially vulnerable populations? And crucially, protecting subjects from harm.
Harm, like physical harm.
Could be, but also psychological or social harm. The source uses scared straight programs as an example. The idea was to deter kids from crime by showing them harsh prison realities. But some studies found these programs actually increased offending among participants. Researchers have an ethical duty to anticipate and minimize potential negative consequences.
These are really critical considerations. It's not just about finding data, it's about doing it responsibly.
Absolutely. There's a real ethical weight that comes with this kind of research.
So, let's wrap up this foundational deep dive. We've defined criminology as studying lawmaking, law-breaking, and the reaction. We traced its history from superstition through classical ideas of choice, positivist searches for causes, sociological focuses on environment and learning, and conflict views on power.
We definitely saw how understanding the criminal law itself, how it's made, how it evolves, is inseparable from studying crime.
And we explored how even the definition of crime is contested territory, viewed through lenses of consensus, conflict, or social interaction.
Right, finishing with those vital ethical considerations that anyone working or learning in this field needs to keep in mind.
Understanding these foundations, these different perspectives and historical roots, it feels absolutely essential for making sense of crime and justice issues today. It's clearly a field built on layers of thought, still evolving.
It really is. And maybe something for you, the listener, to think about as you continue exploring crime. If the definition of crime itself isn't fixed, if it's shaped by social values, by power, by who gets to label whom, what does that really tell us about our attempts to control it? Can a complex, diverse society ever truly agree on what crime is, or what the ultimate purpose of criminal law should be?
Really provocative questions to consider. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the foundations of criminology.